class. We've been studying different text structures. Today we're going to use compare and contrast in our reading and writing. Review. Compare and contrast are ways of looking at objects and thinking about how they're alike and different. For instance, all these foods are alike because they're kinds of foods. And there are many ways they're also different. For instance, they belong to different food groups. Some must be cooked before eating. Some can be eaten raw. When you write compare and contrast, you'll pay attention to these kind of details. As a reader, it helps to know why the writer used compare and contrast. There's actually two different reasons. One is to explain something, and the other is to evaluate. When you explain something, you might compare or contrast different kinds of foods, for instance, helping someone understand which foods need to be refrigerated and which can be stored in a cabinet or a bowl on the counter. When you evaluate something, you might compare and contrast kinds of foods to show why one kind of food or brand of food is better than another. For example, apples are a better snack than butter. When you're writing your topic, you're going to want to make sure that your items can be compared and contrasted. For example, it wouldn't make sense to compare a truck with crayons or crayons with a birdhouse. They just don't have anything in common. So to be sure to compare things that belong together for your topic. We're already pretty good at comparing things when we're reading. When you're writing, you're going to just want to find things that are similar or things that are similar enough that people that are your audience can kind of see what you're talking about. That they're both fruits, that they're both foods, that they're both juices, that they both grow on trees. Those are some of the examples they used for comparing apples to oranges. Think about how that might work for when you're writing about your topic. And we're really good at looking for contrasting items when we're reading. When you're writing, you really have to do both. You can't just compare how they're the same. You also have to say how they're different. Even if it feels obvious, you can't assume that your reader knows the information that you know. We make comparisons all the time in real life. Maybe you want to buy some candy. You go to the store, you look at all the candy that's available, but you can't buy it all. So you have to narrow it down to your choices. So you compare and contrast the different kinds of candy. That helps you make your decision. We're comparing the kinds of candy by how they're alike. All the kinds of candy are sweet, none of them are sour. All of them are medium-sized, none are too big or small. Then you start comparing how they're different. Some of the candy is chocolate, some is hard candy. Some pieces of candy have filling like caramel or cookies, some don't. Some of the candy can be broken into smaller pieces, while others would be a little harder to share. In that real-life scenario, you'd have to make a decision once you've made your comparison. If you're in the mood for chocolate, you wouldn't choose jelly beans or peppermint candy. And if you want to share, you probably not pick candy that can't be broken into smaller pieces. So you'd have to decide on the plain chocolate candy because it was the closest thing that matched all the things you wanted. Can be said for when we compare and contrast in our writing. It's used in writing to organize an individual paragraph, as well as how to organize the entire paper. For instance, you might write a paper that compares a movie with a book about the same topic. In your paper, you can compare and contrast the movie version with the book version. There are three strategies that authors use to organize compare and contrast papers. They use whole-to-whole or block comparison, they use similarity to difference, and they use point-by-point. In the whole-to-whole or block strategy, you say everything about one of the items, and then you say everything about the other. For instance, going back to the movie versus the book version of the same topic. You would tell everything you had to tell about the book. Then you tell everything that you had to tell about the movie. Whole-to-whole comparison and contrast uses a separate section or paragraph for each item you're discussing. For a paper comparing and contrasting a book to a movie, for example, the section for number 1 would include everything about the book. The section number 2 would cover everything about the movie. The points in each of the sections should be the exact same, so that they should be explained in the exact same order. For instance, you might discuss the characters, settings, and plots, but you need to do that for both of them. Some authors choose to use similarities to differences. In this, they use two different paragraphs, first discussing how things are the same. The second paragraph would be how things are different. In a point-by-point strategy, you explain one point of each comparison before moving on to the next point. For instance, you would write about the characters in the book and the movie in one section. Then you'd write about the settings in the book and the movie in the next section. Graphic organizers can be helpful tools for gathering details about the items that you're comparing and contrasting. Venn diagrams help you think about where the various characters of the items are being compared and contrasted fit. The compare and contrast chart is more like a listing tool, where you can brainstorm a list of ways that items are alike and different. Let's look at this two-circle Venn diagram. It's made up of two overlapping circles that allow you to organize information about two items that you're comparing and contrasting. You write the characteristics of the item inside the circles. Features that apply to both go in the overlapping section of the circles. When you're done, you have your information divided into similarities, the overlapping part, and the differences, the non-intersecting parts. This three-circle Venn diagram is made up of three overlapping circles, which means you're comparing and contrasting three separate things and seeing what similar things they share. This is an example of a compare and contrast chart. It's made up of a series of boxes that you fill in to gather information about two items that you're comparing and contrasting. You write the names of your items at the top, then fill in the boxes with details about how the items are alike and how they're different. This chart's an easy way to divide the characteristics of the items that you're trying to compare into similarities and differences. I've read a lot of compare and contrast articles, but in writing, it's important to remember that transition words tell a reader that the writer is changing from talking about one item to talking about the other. Transitional words and phrases help make a paper smoother and more coherent by showing the reader the connections between the ideas that are being presented. When you're comparing items, using a transition from this list will signal the reader that you're changing from one item to the next. It will also tell the reader that two items are similar. Here's some examples. The characters in the movie were very similar to the characters in the book. Both the characters in the movie and in the book were interested in detective work. So to compare things, we would use also, as well as, both, in the same manner, in the same way, like, likewise, most important, same, similar, similarly, the same as, and to, meaning also. There's also some words we would use to signal to your reader that two items are going to be different in your discussion. Here's some examples. The setting in the book was summer, while the setting in the movie was winter. The events in the book took place during several afternoons, but the events in the movie took place during the evening. So words to contrast are although, but, differ, even though, however, in contrast, instead, nevertheless, on the contrary, on the other hand, unless, unlike, while, and yet. Don't worry, you don't need to memorize these. I'll provide a sheet of these for you to go over when you're ready to write. Here are the things that we need to pay attention to as we write a compare and contrast paper. The purpose and the supporting details, the organization and structure, the transitions and coherence. In addition, of course, we're going to pay attention to the usual things like spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Not everyone's paper is going to be a compare and contrast, but it does help to know what one would contain and what you would be graded on. A, your paper would need to compare and contrast the items clearly. B, the paper points to specific examples to illustrate the comparison. And C, The paper includes only the information relevant to the comparison. There isn't any extra. You would also be graded on the organization and structure of your paper. A. The paper breaks the information into the whole-to-whole, similarity to differences, or the point-by-point structure. B. The paper follows a consistent order when discussing the comparison. And C. The paper breaks the information into appropriate sections or paragraphs. The last thing you'd be graded on is transitions and coherence. The paper needs to move smoothly from one idea to the next. The paper needs to use comparisons and contrast transition words to show a relationship between the ideas. And the last thing is, the paper uses a variety of sentence structures and transitions, so it doesn't sound too monotonous or boring. Now that we've got some compare and contrast skills, we're going to use them to practice together.